After the release of Resident Evil 2, the game would quickly go on to become another one of the best-selling titles ever on the PlayStation. Knowing that they had to continue to cash in on the success of the Resident Evil brand, the team at Capcom would quickly get to work on making a new installment for the franchise. During the pre-production process of this new title, a planned port of Resident Evil 2 for the Sega Saturn was cancelled due to hardware limitations, which upset some of the leadership at Capcom. The original Resident Evil had been successfully ported to the Saturn about a year beforehand and had performed quite well on the system sales-wise, so Capcom knew that Sega fans were an easy sell for some Resident Evil content. This would lead some higher-ups at Capcom to request that Shinji Mikami shift development of the next mainline entry to Sega's upcoming Dreamcast console, which would be a much more powerful system than the PS1, much less the Sega Saturn. The team had recently actually decided to scrap an RE3 build that they were working on for the PS1, so he was glad to do it, and work on the Dreamcast title would start soon after, but there was one more complication. Sony was trying to negotiate with Capcom to get the exclusive rights to this upcoming Resident Evil 3, and they wanted it to release exclusively on one of their systems. And the money Sony was offering must have been pretty good, because Capcom made an effort to compromise with them on the matter. At the time, there were multiple Resident Evil branded side projects in the works, and one of them was going to feel very similar to the first two games. It was being developed for the PlayStation and had a plot revolving around a brand new character trying to escape from the Raccoon City Outbreak that we saw in Resident Evil 2. So the deal that Capcom and Sony eventually came to is that they would turn this specific spin-off into a mainline entry by slapping that big old Resident Evil 3 title on there and changing the new character to instead be Jill Valentine from the original game. And after about a year and a half of development, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was released to the world in September of 1999. So would this beefed up spin-off be able to stand alongside the first two games in the series, or would its origins as a side project leave it feeling like the weak link? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the third in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise. While you don't have to have seen the first couple videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with those games if you haven't seen them, so I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is a survival horror game developed and published by Capcom for the PlayStation in 1999. The game takes place about a day before the events of Resident Evil 2, where we play as returning STARS member Jill Valentine trying to escape from the T-virus outbreak in Raccoon City. And while RE1 and RE2 are both games that I've played through roughly once a year for the majority of my life, I actually hadn't played Resident Evil 3 for about a decade before recording through it for this video, as I just never really connected with this game the same way I did with the first two when I was younger. So instead of going into this video knowing the game really well and pretty much knowing what I wanted to talk about before even writing the script, this felt much more like I was experiencing the game for the first time. So for you big RE3 fans out there, bear with me a bit if I get something wrong or overlook something, and for those of you who enjoy my videos more when I'm going in blind and giving you some fresh opinions, this is pretty much going to be one of those. Anyway, the general tone of the game is immediately set when starting up a new playthrough, as the game opens with Jill literally flying out of her exploding apartment building while running away from zombies. From the very moment that RE3 begins, the entire game is an action-packed, desperate escape from Raccoon City. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. We all know that any good game review starts by talking about the visuals, so let's knock that out real quick. The simplest way that I could describe the visuals of Resident Evil 3 would be by telling you that it looks almost exactly like Resident Evil 2, but it's very slightly downgraded from that title. The pre-rendered backgrounds still look amazing here, but the character and enemy models have noticeably less detail and polygons when compared to RE2. This is almost definitely because RE3 has the most enemies on screen at any given time out of the PS1 trilogy and needed to optimize things to be able to run smoothly. But we'll come back to that soon. Thankfully though, there is an area where RE3's visuals have improved over RE2's, as there are a lot more dynamic elements like flashing lights and flames in the backgrounds, which definitely make the city feel a bit more alive than it would otherwise. So on the whole, the visuals are a little better in some areas and a little worse in others, meaning the game is largely on par with RE2 here. With all that said though, if you're a fan of Resident Evil 2, it'll be hard to get caught up on all the little differences in visual quality, as you'll spend the majority of your time in this game running around the streets of Raccoon City. So for anyone who liked seeing those more open city environments in RE2 and wished there was a bit more of that stuff, this is basically a whole game of it. It's really awesome that the developers finally gave fans of the series the opportunity to fully explore Raccoon City after building up so much lore around the town throughout the first 2 games. And I have to say that even though I'd played this game before, it weirdly still felt like a treat to me during my playthrough. There's even a ton of nice callbacks to the first 2 games here, like how there's a short revisit to the RPD near the beginning of the game, and while you're there, you'll find a fax from the owner of the local gun store who dies during the opening of RE2. Just little things like that really make it feel like the developers of the game loved the material they were working with as much as the fans did. And exploring the city is made even more enjoyable by the awesome level design work here. Those of you who saw my RE2 video might remember that the level design is pretty much my only major hang-up with that game, but honestly, I feel like RE3 makes some major improvements over it. The game feels like it's much more open-ended than RE2, especially in the downtown area, where when I first found the map of the area, I realized that there were pretty much 4 different ways that I could go about tackling the district. I massively prefer this sort of level design that lays out a bunch of options in front of you and lets you decide how to approach it as compared to RE2's much more linear level design, even though it does admittedly make for some slightly worse pacing at times. I don't think the level design here in RE3 is quite as good as the first games, but it's honestly pretty damn close, which really surprised me during my revisit. In terms of its core gameplay though, Resident Evil 3 once again sticks very close to what was established in the series' first outing. You'll be making your way through the city, either running around or fighting your way through groups of monsters while finding key items and solving puzzles to continue to make more progress. The big thing that sets RE3 apart from the others though, is that it is by far the most action-packed Resident Evil title yet. Like I mentioned before, there are massive numbers of enemies on screen at any given time, making it feel like you're genuinely fighting your way through hell on Earth. The game also features the most diverse roster of enemies in the series so far, even including a new revision of the hunters from the first game, and these giant bug monsters, which definitely don't creep the hell out of me. Add on to all that this game has the highest number of boss encounters in the series so far, with Jill even squaring off against a goddamned attack helicopter at one point. Yes, I'm dead serious, just one female cop taking down an attack chopper single-handedly. Nothing to see here. Some new mechanics and systems have been introduced here to account for this more action-heavy design, with the first of these being the new quick turn move. This one is incredibly straightforward, allowing players to quickly turn 180 degrees with the press of a button. This is a really nice addition to the series' classic tank controls, though honestly, I've never really gotten much use out of it. That's not because it isn't useful, because it definitely is, but I think that since I grew up playing RE1 and 2 so much, I kind of just got used to playing these games without it, and tend to forget that it's even there. Something much more transformative though, is what the developers call the emergency dodge. This is a new mechanic where if players can press a button just a few frames before an enemy's attack connects, they can dodge out of the way and completely avoid taking damage. This is a little tricky to get used to, but if you can get the hang of it, the benefits of being able to consistently avoid attacks are well worth the effort. Like I've mentioned before in these videos, the control scheme that these classic RE games use isn't very suited for high-stakes boss fights, but the emergency dodge now allowing you to skillfully dodge attacks fixes that issue pretty well. That being said, it does have a bit of wonkiness to it. The dodge doesn't have any invincibility frames, so it's fairly common to get hit in the middle of your dodge animation, even in the event that you do pull it off correctly. This will happen to you at least once every few dodges or so while it isn't a perfectly implemented mechanic, it's still one that's well worth learning, especially when it comes to the game's boss fights. The execution of it certainly could have been better, but I really do enjoy the addition of the emergency dodge here, which surprised me since I don't really remember enjoying the mechanic all that much when I played this game all those years ago. But with just how many enemies are packed into the game, as well as the increased emphasis on boss fights, you would think that the ammo situation would get pretty desperate, right? Well, not really. The designers have placed more ammunition around in the environments, and they've also added an entirely new ammunition creation system on top of that. As soon as you start a new playthrough, Jill will have access to what the game calls the reloading tool, which can be used alongside various types of gunpowder that can be found around the city to craft more ammo. As you craft more of a specific ammo type, you'll also be able to level up your ammo creation skill, allowing you to create more of that ammo type. So at the start of the game, you'll only be able to make 15 pistol rounds out of every gunpowder you find, but by the end of a playthrough, you could potentially create 20 rounds out of one gunpowder. It might sound like a really small difference, but an extra 5 rounds per gunpowder you find really adds up and goes a long way. On top of that, once you're proficient enough in a certain ammo type, you'll be able to create enhanced ammo that deals more damage. So not only do you have 5 more pistol rounds per gunpowder, but those individual rounds are also dealing more damage than they did at the start of the game, meaning that it now takes less rounds to put an enemy down than it did at the beginning of your run. And somehow, we're more than 10 minutes into this video now, and I still haven't even mentioned why the game is subtitled Nemesis. So, allow me to introduce you to the biggest and baddest enemy of the original Resident Evil trilogy, the Nemesis. The Nemesis is a highly experimental tyrant that is the result of Umbrella implanting one of their new T-103s with some unknown parasite. This parasite would then succeed in hijacking the brain functions of the Nemesis without killing the host, resulting in a much more easily controllable tyrant that also happens to be considerably stronger than any of its siblings. He's been sent into Raccoon City with one very specific goal: track down any surviving STARS members and eliminate them to ensure that they can't leak any information about the Umbrella Mansion facility they found 2 months ago. In terms of gameplay, he's basically just the T-103 from Resident Evil 2, but far more dangerous. He'll show up at random points throughout your playthrough, presenting players with the choice of either fighting him or running away from him. Unlike the T-103 though, if you do choose to run away from him, he'll continue lurking around the area searching for you and is capable of moving between different rooms to hunt you down. There's even a distinct music theme that plays whenever he's nearby, leading to a very potent sense of dread in those situations where you're trying to reach a typewriter before he finds you so that you don't lose an hour or so of your progress. If you do decide to fight him though, he'll put up a damn good fight. He's a very fast and aggressive enemy who can kill you incredibly quickly if you're not on your A game, especially if he happens to bring his rocket launcher along with him. And yes, I'm dead serious, a Resident Evil boss with a rocket launcher. If you manage to bring him down though, he'll drop a reward for you much like the T-103. But instead of just dropping you some ammo, he drops things like parts to make an upgraded handgun or shotgun, and even a new item called the First Aid Box, which can store 3 full healing items for you in just 1 inventory slot. So he's much more dangerous to take on than the T-103 was, but he's much more rewarding to actually learn how to fight thanks to the incredible rewards that he drops. However, there is one gripe that I have with these rewards, though it's more of a symptom of the ammunition creation system than with the rewards themselves. These upgraded weapons you can get from Nemesis, like the handgun and the shotgun, are really great, but for whatever reason, you can't load the enhanced rounds into them. So if you want to use the enhanced pistol rounds that you've learned how to craft, you'll have to leave the new fancy handgun behind and instead take the one that you started the game with. Either that, or just carry both handguns with both kinds of pistol rounds, which is less than practical. I'm sure that this was done for balancing reasons, but come on, man. The player has to earn both the upgraded gun and the upgraded rounds through gameplay, so if they manage to earn both, just let them use both of them together. Despite that one hang-up though, I really did find myself loving the Nemesis encounters during my recent run. I remember this guy scaring the shit out of me when I played the game back as a kid, but this time around, I took the time to get really good at dodging his attacks and returning fire when it was safe to, and I had an absolute blast once I was able to pull that stuff off consistently and get rewarded for it. And while I haven't really mentioned it yet, this is the first time in the Resident Evil series that there's only one campaign to play through. This might sound like a downgrade on the surface, but the one scenario that this game has is still very high quality. Along with that, the designers added what they called the live selection system. This is a fun little mechanic where at certain points in the story, you'll be presented with 2 choices that will affect the outcome of whatever situation Jill has found herself in. It can be really fun to see what happens when selecting the different options, but I've heard some people in the past say that RE3 has like 10 different paths you can play through, and that's frankly just disingenuous. I mean, sure, you can choose a bunch of different options throughout the game, but they almost never have an impact on anything outside of the exact scene that you're in. Sometimes it does have a small effect, like this one time that I chose to jump out of a window to avoid Nemesis, which did give me access to an alleyway with a couple of herbs that would otherwise be inaccessible, but that's all that changed in that one specific decision. Even though there are roughly 10 decision points throughout the campaign, there are only 2 different endings in the game, and they're really just the same ending with a different person flying the helicopter in the final cutscene. It's a really fun system, but it's nothing more than a slight novelty, so don't let anyone convince you that RE3 has this large branching storyline or anything like that. Speaking of the story, something else that I noticed during my recent playthrough is that Resident Evil 3 definitely has the sloppiest translation work of the series so far. It's normally completely fine, but every once in a while, you'll come across some awkward or broken English in the documents and notes scattered throughout the environments. One of my favorites that I found during my run is "This diseases is unlike anything I have ever witnessed. Once the patient's mind is gone, they become flesh hunger monsters." It's never so bad that you can't tell what it's supposed to say or anything, but you can just tell that the translation work was probably a bit rushed during this game's production. Though if we're being honest, coming across random things like this could be pretty funny and add to the overall charm of the game at times. On a similar note, the voice acting is still rough here, but thankfully, it's worse than what we got in Resident Evil 2. For those of you who haven't seen my other videos, I know what you're thinking. Why is it a good thing that it's worse than the voice acting in Resident Evil 2? Well, it's simple. When the dialogue is this bad, it wraps back around to being so awkward and cheesy that it adds to the overall charm of the game.
Relax, you're fine.
If you say so, but my head feels like it's about to explode. Anyway, name's Carlos. Glad to meet you, lady.
Mikhail, do you have some kind of death wish?
My people, they were wiped out by these monsters. I can't stop just because I'm wounded.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
And a quick side note, by the way, I've seen a lot of you guys commenting on these videos telling me that the voice acting in these games is actually really good. I'm personally not one who likes to argue back and forth, but I would like to mention here that it's totally okay to love a game, but also admit its faults. RE1 and 2 are both among my favorite games of all time, and some that I have the most nostalgia for, but I'm more than willing to talk about the things that weren't executed well in them. Not everything has to be perfect in order to be your favorite. You can just love something because you love it, and that's fine. With that being said though, it's about that time of the video where we get into the spoiler section. So if you haven't played Resident Evil 3 for yourself yet and you want to avoid spoilers, now would be the time to skip to the timestamp on screen. Alright, so like I said earlier, the story here revolves around Jill Valentine trying to escape from the same Raccoon City outbreak that we saw in Resident Evil 2. And right off the bat, it should be said that RE3 definitely has the simplest story of the game so far, and the one that builds on the existing lore and continuity the least. It's a very simple escape story without much that really goes on outside of that, but there are some things that are worth mentioning here. First off, pretty early on in the game, players will actually get to meet Brad Vickers, the helicopter pilot who is single-handedly responsible for the STARS team's deaths and trauma from RE1. He's killed by Nemesis very early on in the game, and his corpse is left at the entrance of the RPD. This might sound like a pretty unimportant detail, but players were actually able to encounter Brad as a zombie wandering around the RPD entrance back in RE2. So it's just another one of those fun little touches that really ties the events of RE2 and 3 together. Also early on in the game, Jill will meet Carlos Oliveira, a member of Umbrella's biohazard countermeasure service. As you might imagine, Jill doesn't love the idea of working together with employees from Umbrella, but she ends up needing the UBCS's help in order to escape, leading to a really interesting dynamic between these two. Throughout the game, you'll see her start to trust Carlos more and more, a sentiment that she does not share with another member of the UBCS, Nikolai. Throughout the events of the game, Nikolai acts very suspiciously, causing not only Jill, but also the other members of the UBCS to not trust him. It's revealed as the game goes on that he's actually one of a very select few supervisors who were selected by Umbrella to monitor how the bioweapons engaged with civilians, as well as members of the UBCS and law enforcement. His mission would ultimately be to observe the BOW's behaviors and performance before ensuring that the rest of his squad dies in Raccoon City so that they can't leak anything about the incident, and returning back to Umbrella HQ to report on his findings. This of course leads to confrontations between Jill and Nikolai near the end of the game, and while his fate is ultimately unknown as nothing directly states what happened to him in the series canon, I personally ended up shooting down his escape helicopter during my playthrough in the boss fight that I mentioned earlier. Nikolai being in contact with Umbrella HQ throughout the events of the game is also how we learn about the one really important thing in this game's plot that does affect the overall narrative of the series: the nuking of Raccoon City. See, I mentioned earlier in the video that RE3 takes place about a day before the events of RE2, and while that's true, what I didn't mention is that it actually takes place over the course of a few days and simply starts a day before RE2. So after the point where Leon and Claire would have escaped from the city already, we learn that the US government has opted to nuke the city in order to prevent the infection from spreading to the rest of the country. This puts a hard time limit on Jill's escape from the city, and we end up cutting it really close when we escape near the end. If you end up getting the best ending like I did in my run, the greatest character to ever grace a work of fiction, Barry motherfucking Burton, ends up rescuing Jill and Carlos in a helicopter just moments before the ballistic missile hits Raccoon City and wipes it off the map. And as far as things in the story that are worth discussing, that's about it. RE3 probably has the weakest and most unimportant Resident Evil story so far, but it's still really enjoyable for what it is and has some pretty fun moments. If you're someone who plays these games primarily for the story, then I could recommend this if Jill Valentine is one of your favorite characters, but otherwise, there's not a whole lot really here. Overall though, I was very pleasantly surprised by my revisit to Resident Evil 3. Like I said near the start of the video, I always thought of this one as being the weak link of the trilogy, but after my recent playthrough, I can see that I was way too hard on Resident Evil 3 over the years. It certainly has its issues and its ways that it fails to live up to RE2, but it also has a lot of new and really fun things that I've just frankly never given enough credit to. I had an absolute blast learning how to dodge properly and handing Nemesis' ass to him once I had, and it honestly made me eat my words on tank controls not lending themselves to difficult boss fights. It might just be a bit of recency bias since it's been so long since I last played RE3, but I honestly had as much fun replaying this as I did replaying 2 a couple weeks ago. And look you guys, I've been seeing the comments from those of you who have been around since before the Resident Evil series. I was trying something out with not doing the number scores at the end of the videos, since I've had a solid amount of people over the last year or so tell me that they don't like them, but I was shocked by the amount of you who asked me to bring them back after only a couple videos of not doing them. So to top the video off, I'm gonna give Resident Evil 3 Nemesis a 9.1. And also here are the scores for the first 2. Well, hey there guys, thanks for coming by and spending a bit of your day with me. For those of you who, for whatever reason, want to spend more of your day with me, I just so happen to live stream right here on the channel almost every single day. If you've ever seen me do a video on a game before, you can typically expect that I'll be hanging out and playing it on stream at some point as well, so feel free to swing by and say hi if that's your thing. Just be warned if you do decide to swing by that I can say some pretty wild things when I'm not filtering myself like I do in these videos, so the whiplash from video to stream Chole can be pretty insane. Fuck my throat. Whoa. And if you're looking to support the channel, as well as join the incredible group of people who make this all possible, feel free to check out my Patreon or my YouTube memberships. But with all my shameless plugging out of the way, I'm gonna get back to work on the next one, so I'll hope to see all of you right here for the next Resident Evil review.